Maybe you've noticed it in someone you once knew well, or quietly within yourself. There comes a moment when a person begins to step back from the noise of the world, not out of sadness or disillusionment, but because something inside shifts. The external rush no longer holds the same pull. Conversations that once felt natural now seem shallow. Solitude, instead of feeling like loneliness, starts to feel like nourishment. From the outside, it can look like a disappearance. But internally, something deeper is happening, a return. It's as though the center of life moves from the outer world into an inner landscape where everything is quieter, slower, and more honest. The desires that once drove you, to be seen, understood, approved, lose their urgency. What matters now is alignment, not attention. Nothing is wrong. You are not losing connection with life. You are beginning to connect with it in a different way. Spiritual traditions and Jungian psychology both describe this stage as a necessary passage, a time when the soul reorganizes life around what is true, not what is expected. It is a gentle crossing from living outward to living inward, a shift from performance to presence. It can feel like stepping away, yet it is really a stepping in, toward clarity, toward authenticity, toward the quiet truth of who you are. And if this feels familiar, you may already be entering a stage that only spiritually awakened people experience. A quiet disappearance that is not an ending, but an invitation to live from the self. You notice, slowly at first, that something inside you is calling you away from the noise of the world. It doesn't feel like running. It feels like an inner transformation guided by the unconscious mind, whispering that there's more beneath the surface. Without trying, you sense old archetypes stirring, as if they've been waiting for this spiritual awakening. Friends see you becoming quieter, more reflective, but you don't mind. The self feels like it's inviting you home. In Jungian psychology, this quiet shift marks the beginning of a sacred journey. Sometimes you sit in silence, feeling the power of the mind settle into your bones. It's subtle, but unmistakable. Something is changing, and it feels like the opening chapter of a story only you can live. As days pass, peaceful walks alone nourish you more than crowded tables. You sense you are entering a stage of individuation, the slow return to your true center. Silence becomes your mentor in depth psychology, teaching more about the meaning of life than 1,000 empty conversations. You begin listening to your dreams with curiosity, practicing gentle dream interpretation as if each symbol arrives with a personal message. Small moments, sunlight, breath, stillness, become portals. You can't always explain what's happening, but you feel yourself waking up, layer by layer. It feels ancient, like remembering rather than learning. The hero's journey is beginning inside you, quietly but powerfully. There is humor in this shift. Once afraid of being alone, now you treat cancelled plans like a divine gift. The inner voice of the self guides you to examine your own projection and perception, revealing where the repressed self still hides in the shadows. Memories resurface, some tender, some painful, calling you toward healing the inner child with emotional awareness. You start sensing that solitude is not empty. It's emotional alchemy, slowly transforming fear into strength. On some days you journal, and on others you simply breathe, welcoming both light and darkness with equal respect. You realize this silence is full, alive, guiding, and deeply honest. You laugh at how life once pushed you toward noise, while now your heart longs for simplicity. It's not about withdrawing from the world. It's about choosing what's real. You see how many relationships were built on a persona that never reflected your true nature. Jung would call this shadow work, the tender process of learning how to face your shadow with compassion. Some nights you write your thoughts with surprising clarity, as if they were offered from the collective unconscious. This feels mythic, like walking through an ancient initiation. Even though you move quietly, You feel more alive than ever, like your soul finally has space to breathe. Then, the synchronicities begin. Little signs, strange coincidences. Someone recommends the perfect book. A stranger says exactly what you needed to hear. Jung and modern psychology call this synchronicity explained. Moments when the inner and outer world mirror each other. You start sensing symbols and meaning everywhere, guiding you deeper into consciousness. You feel the alchemy of trauma turning old wounds into wisdom. Solitude sharpens your awareness, teaching you to honor both light and darkness within the human psyche. And while this new inner rhythm feels quiet, the next stage is stirring, because soon, the old social mask you've worn for years will begin to dissolve. As your spiritual awakening deepens, the old social mask begins to loosen. You feel the persona, carefully crafted over years to fit in, quietly cracking. The identity you built to blend in at school, at work, in relationships, suddenly feels fragile. Jungian psychology explains that when the unconscious mind begins to surface, persona and shadow start to collide. This collision exposes the places where you've traded authenticity for acceptance. It's uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that never truly belong to you. The power of the mind now pushes you to tell the truth, especially to yourself. And once that process starts, there's no going back. You notice the subtle ways you used to mold yourself, laughing at what didn't amuse you, agreeing just to keep the peace, softening your voice so others wouldn't feel threatened. Little by little, the desire to please fades. You no longer feel responsible for managing everyone's emotions. This freedom isn't loud, it's quiet and firm. Saying no becomes an act of inner transformation, a reclaiming of integrity. And although some people may react with confusion or resistance, you sense a spiritual clarity rising within. It's the individuation process, your unconscious mind guiding you home. Old conversations, once tolerable, begin feeling unbearably superficial. Small talk tastes bland, like chewing gum that's lost its flavor. You crave honesty, depth, symbols, and meaning. You'd rather explore the unconscious mind, dream interpretation, or the alchemy of trauma than gossip about neighbors or compare possessions. This shift is not superiority, it's sensitivity. You've become more attuned to archetypes at work in everyday life, the shadow in relationships, and the collective unconscious moving beneath ordinary events. Emotional awareness naturally increases, and the repressed self begins to emerge from forgotten corners. This dissolution of the persona opens the doorway to radical authenticity, something you didn't know you were starving for. You begin speaking from the inner voice of the self rather than from fear. Suddenly, you're honest about what you feel, what you need, what you believe. It's scary and liberating at once. You stop projecting and start seeing. You stop apologizing for existing. You recognize that hiding your true nature was a wound, not a virtue. The integration of shadow work becomes more natural, helping you transform shame into emotional alchemy. This is healing the inner child without forcing anything, just telling the truth. As the persona falls away, something surprising happens. You begin disappearing socially. Not because you reject others, but because your deeper consciousness no longer depends on external validation. The collapse of old masks naturally reduces your presence in circles built on performance. You become selective with your energy, present but less seen. It's not loneliness, it's alignment. The hero's journey often requires walking into the forest alone before returning with wisdom. And as this quiet disappearance progresses, another realization unfolds. When external validation collapses, what remains becomes your real foundation. At some point, you begin to notice that praise, approval, and recognition don't land the same way they used to. It's not that you've become indifferent, it's that your nervous system stops depending on validation as proof of your worth. Your consciousness shifts from seeking outer confirmation to listening to the inner voice of the self. Jungian psychology describes this as a natural stage in the individuation process, where the human psyche withdraws projections from the outside world to reclaim its own power. It's disorienting at first. Without applause, you wonder who you really are. But this uncertainty is the doorway to inner transformation. Because the persona is dissolving, you no longer feel compelled to perform emotionally, intellectually, or socially. The power of the mind begins to untangle your identity from what others think, and your heart relaxes. Even compliments feel lighter, almost unnecessary. You realize you used to shapeshift, adjusting tone, beliefs, even personality traits, to stay liked. Shadow work reveals the truth. Much of that behavior came from wounds formed during childhood, where love felt conditional. Healing the inner child helps you see that this collapse of external validation is not a loss, it's emancipation. Of course, this shift can create friction. People who once praised you may suddenly question you when your values stop aligning with their expectations. In relationships, projection and perception become clearer. Someone might accuse you of changing, when what's really happening is that you've stopped acting. The shadow in relationships becomes visible. Those who relied on the old version of you now feel uncertain. This can feel lonely, but it's also profoundly honest. You're learning how to face your shadow without abandoning yourself. And in that tension, emotional awareness grows. Interestingly, your energy becomes more discerning. Instead of chasing opportunities, you feel drawn only to what resonates with your consciousness. You stop pursuing paths that once felt impressive but empty. Whether it's career, friendships, or romantic relationships, you feel guided by symbols and meaning rather than status or applause. Archetypes begin to show up in everyday life. The sage urging solitude, the warrior teaching boundaries, the healer helping you embrace the repressed self. Even moments of silence feel full, like synchronicity explained through intuition rather than logic. Then comes the quiet truth. When validation collapses, you discover authentic motivation. You create because it feels aligned, not because someone is watching. You pursue dreams that once felt unrealistic because they are part of your inner alchemy. Life becomes less about looking successful and more about feeling true. And gradually, you notice that the collapse of external approval becomes oddly peaceful, a relief. This stage doesn't end in emptiness. It opens into something new. Because once the outside no longer defines you, your sensitivity to the world begins to shift in surprising ways. As consciousness expands, your senses become surprisingly refined. Sounds seem sharper, emotions stronger, and subtle energetic shifts more noticeable than ever. It's as if the unconscious mind has turned up the internal volume, revealing layers of reality that once passed unnoticed. Jungian psychology explains that this is often the result of deeper contact with symbolic material rising from the collective unconscious. You feel more connected to the archetypes within, the sage who listens deeply, the healer who intuitively perceives. This new attunement isn't dramatic. It's subtle, like discovering more colors in a familiar painting. You no longer live solely in the physical world. You inhabit emotional, intuitive, and symbolic landscapes simultaneously. The power of the mind expands beyond thought into sensation. You feel truth before you think it. This heightened awareness is part of inner transformation, like your soul switched from radio to surround sound. You're not imagining, you're awakening. And though surprising, this shift is deeply natural on the path of spiritual awakening. Because your senses are sharper, chaotic environments suddenly become almost unbearable. Loud places, crowded rooms, aggressive voices. What once felt tolerable now overloads your nervous system. It's not weakness, it's clarity. You can't dilute your perception the way you used to. When too many energies collide, the psyche interprets it as noise, an interruption of the inner voice of the self. This is where emotional alchemy begins. You learn which spaces nourish you and which drain you. Carl Jung would say your psyche is withdrawing projection from the outside world and forming a stronger inner orientation. Conversations rooted in gossip, competition, or superficial exchanges feel like sandpaper to your spirit. You don't judge. Your system simply can't digest that vibration anymore. The shadow in relationships becomes easier to see. Insecurity, envy, or hidden resentment show up like bright signals. You quietly recognize that your consciousness has outgrown environments built on unconscious patterns. Noise no longer distracts, it suffocates. And so, you step back. With this shift comes an increased capacity to perceive energy, not only your own, but everyone else's. You walk into a room and feel the emotional climate instantly. You sense tension behind someone's smile, exhaustion behind someone's eyes. This isn't fantasy. It's your unconscious mind reading symbolic information through the body, a form of dream interpretation while awake. Jungian psychology associates this with the archetype of the empath or wounded healer, figures who instinctively track emotional landscapes. You begin noticing projection and perception in real time, who blames others for their fears, who hides behind humor, who is secretly grieving. It can be overwhelming at first, but with practice, emotional awareness becomes a compass. You sense when someone's shadow is activated, when their repressed self is speaking. You can feel light and darkness within them without judging either. This sensitivity isn't about knowing everything. It's about listening with the psyche rather than only with the ears. And it turns everyday interactions into symbolic experiences, rich, layered, meaningful. Because your energy is more porous, you instinctively crave simplification. Fewer people, less noise, simple routines that leave room for presence. This isn't a choice. It's a physiological response to awakening. You may feel drawn to nature, quiet mornings, slow evenings, minimalist habits. You start decluttering your outer world to match the clarity of your inner world. Clothes that once felt flashy feel uncomfortable. Social media becomes less appealing. You prefer meaningful speech to constant chatter. This is the collective unconscious teaching you to regulate your energy. You start noticing how certain objects, colors, or sounds influence your emotional state. You might simplify your schedule, reduce exposure to draining relationships, or seek environments that feel sacred or calm. These changes support your individuation process, the journey of becoming who you truly are. When you create space, you hear the inner voice more clearly, and you realize the alchemy of trauma has turned your sensitivity into wisdom. The world slows down, not because you move slower, but because you move with intention. Over time, this new way of being stops feeling strange. You learn to trust what your body communicates. You notice synchronicity explained not only through events, like meeting the right person at the right time, but through sensation, warmth in your chest when something is true, pressure in your gut when something is wrong. Empaths often describe this as knowing without knowing. Jung might call it consciousness responding to symbols and meaning before the rational mind can interpret them. Hypersensitivity stops feeling like a flaw and begins to feel like an inner alchemy, guiding you through the human psyche with subtlety and grace. You honor both light and darkness within yourself and others. And through this refined perception, a beautiful paradox unfolds. You're more awake, more present, and more connected than ever, yet somehow, you begin appearing less visible to the world around you. The quiet disappearance is not an escape. It is a transition, a gentle yet decisive movement from a life organized around external reference into one rooted in inner alignment. It is the phase when spiritually awake people begin to understand that the goal is not to stand out in the world, but to stand within themselves. They do not vanish because they are wounded or afraid. They vanish because their center of gravity has shifted toward the interior, where meaning is generated not by the gaze of others, but by the resonance of the soul. As this shift takes place, a new way of inhabiting reality emerges. They learn to live between worlds, present enough to participate, but no longer fully defined by the surface-level narratives around them. They go to work, smile at neighbors, speak when needed, and can still laugh, love, and engage. Yet simultaneously, there is a quiet background awareness that they are moving through an environment that no longer governs them. Ordinary life becomes a stage they traverse with clarity rather than identification, a space where they can play their role without confusing it with who they truly are. This is not detachment in the cold psychological sense, nor dissociation, nor numbing. It is more akin to discovering an inner room, still, quiet, and self-luminous, where they remain anchored even in the midst of activity. While others may interpret their reduced visibility as withdrawal, internally they are more attuned than ever, observing the symbolic dimensions of events, reading the subtle currents beneath conversations, feeling the emotional weather of a room long before words reveal its climate. Life becomes less literal, more archetypal. Every encounter is layered. Every moment whispers something beneath what is spoken. This dual awareness results in a softer external presence. They become less reactive, less compelled to defend ideas or assert position. They seem calm, slow, gently distanced, not because they are fading, but because they are no longer fighting the world for permission to exist. They no longer need to broadcast themselves to prove they belong. Their belonging comes from within. Along this journey, their social landscape begins to transform. Where they once sought community in numbers, loud rooms, large friend groups, collective ambition, they now feel pulled towards smaller, quieter constellations of people who share their inner tempo. They may maintain cordial relationships with the many, but true affinity moves toward the few. Conversations with these individuals do not pivot around accomplishments or opinions, but around meaning, silent or subtle insights, shared inner work. Silence itself becomes part of the dialogue, no longer awkward, but sacred, a space where truth is allowed to emerge without pressure. These relationships feel more like soul recognition than social exchange, encounters of resonance rather than role. There is mutual protection, mutual respect, mutual stillness. No one tries to fix anyone, impress anyone, or outperform anyone. Presence is enough. A single sentence can carry the weight of an entire story. A glance can replace hours of explanation. These micro-communities are not built through biography or ideology, but through frequency. And perhaps the most remarkable feature of these connections is their effortless intimacy. People recognize each other not by similarity of identity, but by similarity of depth. They can be strangers in the literal sense, and yet feel like old companions who have been walking the same inner path long before this lifetime. These are not relationships of convenience. They are relationships of truth. As the psyche settles into this new mode of existence, something else becomes clear. Purpose remains, but the need for visibility dissolves. The spiritually awake continue to act, create, serve, and offer what they are called to offer, but the motivations change fundamentally. There is no hunger for acknowledgement, no restless need to be witnessed. The work becomes its own fulfillment. Their mission becomes quieter, more precise, free from the performative impulse to display. They realize that truth does not require amplification to be real. It only requires embodiment. So rather than shouting their discoveries from rooftops, they weave them into the fabric of their lives, through the way they listen, the way they speak, the way they move in the world. Their impact becomes subtle, almost invisible, like sunlight through leaves, gentle, real, nourishing, but without spectacle. In this phase, they come to understand a deeper law of spiritual contribution. What is genuine does not need an audience. What is aligned does not seek applause. What is true does not need to convince. Their quiet presence becomes their greatest teaching. Their mere existence, grounded, authentic, unhurried, becomes a kind of silent blessing for those who encounter them. A powerful image to describe this stage is the alchemical hermit, a figure who does not withdraw in fear, but in devotion to inner refinement. He steps away from noise not to escape life, but to distill it, to remove what is false so that what is true can shine more clearly. The hermit is not isolated. He is immersed. His solitude is not emptiness, but a laboratory where every experience becomes material for transformation. Just as ancient alchemists sought to turn lead into gold, the hermit works on the raw substance of his psyche, fear, ego, illusion, burning away what obscures his essence so that a more integrated self can emerge. His lantern, traditionally held close to his chest or extended just one step ahead, symbolizes a profound truth. He does not need to see the entire path. He only needs to know the next right movement. He trusts the unfolding. He becomes quieter, but not diminished, less visible to others, yet more visible to himself. Paradoxically, the more he withdraws from external noise, the more fully he inhabits his own being. He does not disappear to become less. He disappears to become whole. This is the heart of the quiet disappearance, a return to inner sovereignty, a shift from spectacle to essence, from identity to self. The world may perceive him as fading, but internally he is becoming denser, richer, more rooted. His existence flows underground, like water nourishing unseen roots. When fruits appear, they are simply a natural outgrowth of a cultivated inner life. He becomes invisible, but more alive, quieter, but more powerful, less apparent, but more aligned. The disappearance is not the end of participation. It is the beginning of authenticity. It is not a retreat. It is a maturation. It is the moment when one stops trying to be a character in someone else's story and finally returns to the truth of one's own. The quiet disappearance isn't about leaving life behind. It's about returning to it with greater clarity, depth, and truth. If you find yourself walking this path, trust it. You're not fading, you're becoming. If this message resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear where you are on this journey. And if you're ready to explore these deeper stages of spiritual awakening, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and pass it on to someone who might need it today. You never know whose inner light you might help ignite.